It's time now for another edition of the Business of Sports with longtime NHL agent Rich Winter. Join us, Rich. How you doing?
Good day, Jason. A lot of busy days. Started about 4:30 this morning, so be glad to get home.
Yeah. Well, hey guys, come fix Rich's camera over there. So we'll get it so it's actually has him in the frame.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not a good idea.
Yeah. Well, that's true too. So that'll be a little bit better. So there you go. Now, today I know you do a lot of reading, as do I, and in the business of sports, what we're going to talk about, because we're going to have Matt Moissac joining us in the next segment. But today on the show, you've kind of looked into lots of things that go into building a championship team, and there's obviously in the game of hockey there's still a semblance of luck, no question. I know people have talked about that, but there's lots of other elements that go into it, and something we've never really talked about on our show. I've talked about it in different elements and the importance of it in your family life and different things like that, but you really wanted to bring up an idea that you feel maybe gets overlooked specifically in the building of NHL teams.
Well, I think it gets overlooked entirely in the NHL in general, but I think it's something that hasn't been overlooked in the great dynasties that have reared their head in the NFL, NBA, the last number of years, and in college sports over the years. So I think there's a foundational element to what builds great teams, what knits them together, and what creates the synergy that ultimately leads them to being successful. And it starts with a coach that has values that drive this. And there's really one value that I've found over the years. I was lucky to go to UCLA and spend some time with Coach Wooden, met Steve Kerr, coach in Golden State. I've talked to a number of great players. My first contract I ever worked on with as a young man was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's last contract in LA. So I spent some time with Kareem talking about his coach Wooden, got to know Chris Chelios, met Michael Jordan a number of times, talked about Phil Jackson. And there's one element that all of these players and many other players that I've read about and researched that they define as really the foundational element as to why they were successful. And most people won't think of the one word that every single one of Coach K, Steve Kerr, John Wooden, Pete Carroll, and others define as their players defined as the sole single element that drove what they did. And that's love. They knew that their coaches loved them. And what comes with love, it's a deep and meaningful understanding of the people that are under your stewardship. As a parent, you run into a lot of difficult challenges, most of us do with our kids.
Yep.
And you work through them because you love them. And if you love your players, they know it, they feel it, they'll drive through the wall for you. But more importantly, they knit together with their teammates in a way. I like what Phil Jackson put it. He said, I love what I do as a coach because I get the opportunity, and he had it 11 times, obviously, the opportunity to see a bunch of young men knit together by their relationship, by the compassion they have with each other, and to watch them accomplish something collectively that they could never do on their own. That's the magic. That's the magic that drove Phil Jackson, and it's the magic that drove John Wooden. And I think we're missing it. And especially if we don't change the way we do things in hockey, it doesn't filter down to the kids, where we see a lot of grooming. We see a lot of people who are interested in sports for reasons other than the sports themselves, filtering their way into it because we're scared to talk about love. We're scared to talk about, I love a lot of my players. They're like family. And, but we as men don't express that.
Right.
But people like John Wooden expressed it in the way that they conducted themselves, And
I think at times, some people view love as in a weird way of somehow and it doesn't mean that you just because you love them doesn't mean you're not going to challenge them. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean you're not going to push them. It gives them the sense of comfort knowing that you won't abandon them when things go wrong. Right. And you'll support them. And so I guess the question is, how do you feel the NHL, how can teams get a leg up? Because we've talked a lot about AI and analytics and how you can implement that and get an advantage. And 2, 3, 4% advantage can turn out to be a pretty significant advantage, right? Good drafting historically will help you way more than others. So what are the first steps that teams need to do this? And do you believe it comes from the manager? Does it come from the owner? Does it come from the head coach?
It can't come from any of them. They're not equipped to manage the mental part of the game. They're not trained in it. They don't understand it.
Okay.
And it's challenging when you see, because quite often what happens, I remember players in Montreal when I helped the retired players with a lawsuit they had against the NHL years ago. They used to jokingly say that we won 5 cups when Scotty was here. And if he wasn't, we might have won 9. And whether that's true or not, sometimes what happens is you get a coach in the East Coast League that had just a great group of players, right?
Right.
You and I could have coached it. Our kids could have coached them. They would have been 55-2 without them. Then they get a job at a higher level, and they got a pretty good group of players. Again, they do pretty well. And then they get into the NHL, but they're not hydrated with the skills that they need. I like what my friend Michael Gervais, who is the high-performance coach that helped Pete Carroll build the culture he had at Seattle, Steve Kerr's first visit after he got the job in Golden State. And they talk about hydrating coaches with the skills that they need to help players perform at what they call the messy edge, where competition, where championships are won and lost.
Right.
And it's what people don't understand about loving someone is you get to know them and you know how to motivate them. We talk about the game being 99% mental. I think it's 100% mental in some of the big games, but we don't teach it. And then you think about things like players who might struggle with the mental part of the game. They'll go quickly to the doctor to get their ACL looked at, their knees bothering, their hips bothering. They'll get all of that taken care of. Yet they'll go home and have trouble with their mental state and lie in bed and see if they can fix it. And at the end of the day, when we say that's the most important thing, why not deal with it? And if you look at any other business, a high level middle manager, a senior vice president, which is what the equivalent of what a coach would be, you provide them with training and development. We have given none of our coaches in the National Hockey League that I am aware of the training they need to understand these skills. And these skills shouldn't be populated for soft and gentle reasons, warm and fuzzy reasons. They should be populated because it will help you motivate players. It will help you win. It will help you knit your teammates together. And John Wooden, by way of example, he talked to his players. Some of his mantras included, you cannot live a perfect day, guys, unless you learn to do something for someone else who can never repay you, right? Coach Wooden insisted that his players, when they left the building, left the dressing room that they came into cleaner than when they left. They learned to show respect for others around them,
right,
for each other. So what we need to do is we need to give the coach the skills. I think George Mumford, who's a fabulous guy, was the best hire the Oilers have made in a number of years. George has worked with Kobe, he's worked with Michael, gives him a lot of street cred in the room, but I think he was able to help the guys get a little bit better understanding of the game, use some of the Phil Jackson techniques that he actually helped implement when he was there in Chicago with Phil Jackson. And I think it made a big difference in the way that they conducted themselves. And I don't know how much it contributed to them getting to the finals or to this Game 7, but it certainly didn't hurt. So we need to teach these guys, because I look at, there's 2 types of coaches in the National Hockey League. There's the guy you don't want coaching your children. And
right,
hopefully he'll get weeded out over time. And we're seeing more and more of that happening. But there's a bunch of other guys who are really good guys, but they don't know how to motivate. They're in a position that they got elevated to without any skills, and they're scared to say, I don't know if they'd admit it, but they're scared to say, I don't really know how to do this, because they're supposed to know. They're the head coach of an NHL team.
Right.
And yet they're missing out on the most important. I remember the first time I met Coach Wooden, a friend of mine, Andy Hill, played for Coach for a long time, and he was setting up the meeting. It took 7 months to get the meeting. Why? He had a meeting lunch date scheduled for 7 months, because that's how many people wanted to be with him because of the way he impacted their life. And that's the real reward. Coach would tell you, like the championships. I mean, what Coach won 10 NCAA championships the last 12 years he was there, 7 in a row. He had 3 undefeated seasons. But he talks about the lunches he's had with Bill Walton and Kareem and Andy Hill. That's the value of sport. For me, I think of the things that have touched me the most is when I see someone like Marian Hossa, who I've come to love like a brother because of the quality of man he is, to have him set up at the Hall of Fame and talk about the impact I had on his life. That's awesome. Now, the $65 million contract, irrelevant almost at that stage. And so we just need teams to understand, if they want to win, They need to learn the mental game or teach their players the mental game. They need to help knit those players together intellectually, physically, and mentally. And if they don't, their chances of winning diminish. But more importantly, it's a salary cap world. People feel loved and respected. The wives treated with love and respect. They'll stay for a little less than they get anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good business decision all around, but it's one that we're a little uncomfortable with in terms of talking to people. I mean, I don't know how many males or men are listening to this podcast who've told another man that they know how much they love them. They'll feel it. They know it, but we're a little intimidated to say it. And it's amazing when you tell someone in this sport, especially, how much you care for them, how that changes everything.
Ritch Winter joins us in the business of sports. And you talked about the mental side, and we'll have Matt Moissac joining us in a second about that. But the importance, though, it sounds like, yeah, you want to help your players with the mental side, but as much as it should be about the coaches, should it not? Right? And the managers so they know the type of conversations to have.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's what they need. They need training in this area. And Michael Gervais, and I think we should link to a couple of Michael's podcasts on your site afterwards, because his interview with Pete Carroll is illuminating, but the interview he did with Steve Kerr. Steve Kerr played for Greg Popovich and Phil Jackson. What better grounding to become a coach than to play for them? The first thing he did was go see Pete and Michael in Seattle and try and understand how Pete became so successful at multiple levels. And it's just a fascinating interview to listen to, because what Pete sent him home to do the first day after he had been observing for a day, go home, write down your values, the things that are most important to you, and bring them back, and we'll go over them tomorrow. They then ferreted out 4 of them, because Pete's view, and I think it's true, he said, if you don't coach to your values, you'll never be as effective as you could be, because you won't be seen by anybody in the room. They're not stupid. They know when you're authentic and when you're not. So understanding your values, living to your values, helps you elevate the people around you.
Did he say what his values were?
His are compassion, joy, respect, and competitiveness. Now, Pete, on the other hand, is big on love, but he's a competitor. Like, he turns everything. We're going to have Steve Hauska on, I think, in a few weeks, the kicker for the Seattle Seahawks when they won. And you'll hear about the fun they had. And I think with
yeah, so I like, because you make it, when you use the word joy in a lot of times is fun.
Yeah.
And if you have fun drills that bring out the competitive nature of the players, well, now you're touching on both of those at the same time. Your team's getting better because of the competition, but they're also having fun while doing it, right? Like, it's not just like, I got an email the other day from a person telling me about a WHL team who starts their practices with full on, as hard as you can, like physical contact battle drills every day.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's not really fun after a while.
No, you're tired. You're
right.
exhausted.
You're tired, but you don't want to just hammer your teammates time and time again while your coach and GMs watch. It's ridiculous. It's stupid.
Well,
and so it's something that, I'm trying to look into more, because if it actually is true, then it's something that needs to be talked about. But you can have competitive drills that are fun.
You talk to Coach Wooden's players, they were exhausted. They practiced the game at a little bit higher tempo than they would play it. Everybody in NCAA knew what UCLA was going to do before they came in the building, because they had a very simplified offense. They just couldn't stop it. And Coach would always leave practice with a really fun drill, right? Leave them with something to go home with and feel good about themselves. And I think that, the joy thing is pretty interesting, because when you think of players, how many players do you know are just holding my stick, I'm nervous, the coach, I make a mistake, the coach. And if they can be joyful, you go to Golden State practice and you'll see regularly when Steph Curry's running around doing his drills and things, and they all split off after practice, and they have individual nets and their own individual coaches. But because, this is where Steve was very lucky, Steve Kerr was, that his best player bought into his values. And you'll see Steph walking around dribbling the ball a lot of time, and, hey, Steve, if there's someone in there for a visit, look at me. I'm having joy. It's so great. I love this game. And we got into the game because it was fun.
Yeah.
And I think that the burden that you put on players when you can cut them later. You can sit them on the bench. Coach Wooden used to say he brought a really close friend with him every day to every single game called the bench. He had no trouble putting a guy on there if he wasn't doing his job.
Right.
But they understood how much he cared about him, and that wasn't necessarily punishment. It was simply recognition that a man that loved them very much was holding them accountable. And that's the difference between, and people talk about Bill Belichick. If you look up quotes on Bill Belichick's players on love. Now, Bill had a completely different way of going about it.
Right.
He wasn't warm and hugging you, and I'm not sure Phil did any of that either, but they knew in the conversations they had with them that he wanted them so desperately to be as good as they could be.
Yeah.
And, he might not be the guy you invite to, the party at home because he won't be the most dynamic guy in the room, but they knew that he cared about them. And the way he evidenced that, it was the work he put in to help them with their individual games. And we just miss that. Coaches are too busy. X and O's important, not as critical
as
the mental game. Everybody's got the X and O's,
right?
I
would agree. So when we return, we are going to talk to psychologist Matt Moissac about instilling that and maybe just some of the easiest, simple steps on how to start it, right? Because any conversation or any change in what you want to bring, and this could even work for your amateur team that you coach, right? And in any sport, it's irrelevant what the sport is when you're talking about things like this and how it can help. That's coming up next on the Gregor Show, presented by PlayAlberta.ca. It's the business of sports. Gregor and Ritch Winter. 425. Welcome back. Jason Gregor, Ritch Winter with you here on the Gregor Show, presented by PlayAlberta.ca, where you can get in the game. Use the promo code Gregor50 and get a free $50 play at PlayAlberta.ca. Oilers back in action tomorrow, taking on the Vancouver Canucks. Canucks, according to their head coach, very disappointed. And when the coach brings out the disappointed, doesn't rant or rave, I think that always gets the players' attention more. Just like any kid, when your dad or mom is just like, I'm very disappointed in you. That one hits rather than just like freaking out. You almost wish they'd rather yell at you sometimes. But when they do, they're very calm. I'm disappointed in you. Ooh, that one seems to hit a little bit deeper. So maybe we'll ask about the psychology of that with our next guest. We're talking the business of sport today with Ritch Winter. We're talking about the importance of love in sports in the organization and how you build that and foster it and culture it. And Ritch has been around the NHL for 35 years and feels that a lot of organizations, no, there's been some for sure. He's got some examples we'll use later, but that it's something that is hard to get in, specifically as simple as how many guys listening right now tell their friends, like, you might say, hey, buddy, I love you, give you a hug, but do you ever say why you love them? Like, think about it. It doesn't happen very often if we're being truthful, right? Like, it's you might say it in your relationship to your spouse. Even then, you might say, I love you lots, but you don't really say why you love them.
Or with that deep and meaningful resonance that makes them like pause for a minute, almost like, what's going on? You're like, it does really change the dynamic. And it is surprising that, people don't really understand the fuel that drives these great teams.
Yeah. Matt Moissac is a registered psychologist at Mind Buffs, and he joins us once again. Matt, welcome back to the show, man. How you doing?
Good, man. Thanks for having me. I felt like a racehorse chomping at the bit, listening to you guys talk about all these things, because this is exactly what I love to talk about, and it's cool having these conversations on the air. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. And so Ritch talked about, like, the need to educate coaches, first of all, and like how to have those conversations to do it. And I know you're a sports psychologist. You work with a lot of individuals on players and how to be mentally strong, right? Like deal with adversity and not focus on things that are out of control and all that. But this is very different, right? Like this is especially from coaches and maybe even players, because if you grew up as a player, maybe you didn't have a lot of love and you had a lot of, angst in your family. Sometimes it's hard for people to look at someone who really tells them they love them and not feel awkward. So how would you go about, instructing coaches, whether it's pro or even at the minor level, to start to implement things that focus on a loving culture in the group?
Vulnerability is incredibly uncomfortable. Even when you look at your wife and you just try to say something nice to them, or in reverse, when someone tries to say something nice to you, you can kind of feel that, like that feeling in your chest, like, I don't want to fully accept it. Because vulnerability, especially for men, is like something we're almost allergic to. And
Right.
So we grow up in sport, we grow up around other men, and we're told that to be a really successful, high-driven person, that there's no room for emotion. And the irony in all that is, when you simplify sports psychology down to its like root source, it's all about maximizing how I can get into flow state and how long I can stay into it, right?
Okay.
Yeah, the reason why we
What's
keep
flow state?
doing so flow state is like being in the zone.
Okay.
It's the reward that we get as athletes, as podcast hosts, as radio hosts, where if I do something X amount of times and I'm in a safe environment, I don't have to think about it. My brain just does it. It's that muscle memory.
Right.
And the irony is that you don't think yourself into flow state. You don't just like tell yourself the magic word and then you get into flow state.
Yeah.
Flow state's a feeling state. When you're feeling the right way, when you're at the right level of emotional activation, that's how we get into flow state. And so, everything you guys are talking about being in a culture of like love and support, it makes a person feel emotionally safe to be able to get into their flow state. But that's hard in an elite sport because, to Rich's point, a lot of elite coaches, they play games, they try to pit the players at each other rather than generating like a competitive with culture. It's a competitive at culture.
Okay.
So there's a lot that coaches need to be educated on to understand how they can utilize psychology to bring the best out of their players.
And is it more difficult to do that? Because, in some cases, like, you got a dressing room of 18 to 20 players, and to try to bring that, well, someone might feel it like love. The other person might, as you mentioned, feel all uncomfortable about it. So like, is there an initial step you'd recommend to take to start the process?
100%. So I think the reason why Ritch had referenced the Steve Kerr podcast with Michael Gervais is that they talked about like what those initial steps were to be able to like feel confident about the vision that Steve had as a coach to build that culture. As a coach, as a leader, as a parent, you need to know what your values are, because the values are what guides you. It's the direction that you're going in. And so if you can bring other people on board to share in those values, you're not going to make everyone happy. That doesn't mean that everyone's always happy and content. There's going to be difficult conversation. There's going to be boundaries that need to be set. But when everyone can buy into that shared vision of like, this is the direction that we're going and this is how we're going to do it, then you don't even have to control those variables. You have this entire army of people who are working together to kind of see those goals come through. I mean, that's why team sports are so addictive, because there's also group flow state, and that's way more powerful than individual flow states. So it's a lot of fun.
So, and that was the next question, because you work with individuals, but there's so much emphasis on the team, right? Nobody's above the team. Everybody has to fit in whatever their role is. And, in hockey, hey, you're not on the power play, but you might be a penalty killer, shot blocker. And that's a huge, important role, but it doesn't necessarily get the, outside the room, the same thing. So group flow is something that I find fascinating, because you say it's more fun in a way. Why is it? And is it harder to get into group flow than an individual flow?
In group flow state, it's that moment where every single person that is committed to the goal is putting everything they have towards it. You don't have to talk about it. You don't have to think about it. It's just something that you feel with the people around you, that everyone is committed. And as Steph Curry said about his coach, Steve Kerr, like, I would run through a wall for my coach. It's that feeling that I will give everything I have to complete this mission as a group. And the only way to do that is to ensure that each individual on the team has a sense of pride and ownership over like what their role is. Like, one of my huge pet peeves, and this happens even at the NHL level, is for some reason like coaches think that it's a good idea to wait until the last possible second to tell which goalie is getting like the starting position. Why? Why is that a thing? Why do they do that? Like, tell them, give them time to prepare, let them know that like, I trust you, I believe in you, and like, let's go do this thing. Why does that happen, guys?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's just it's just interesting because, Matt, if you don't, we all know the selfish player, the guy that won't pass, he shoots in the empty net, he doesn't pass. That creates a real dysfunctional element in terms of trying to accomplish flow. And it's really interesting. I remember Coach Wooden talking to a player that I know very well when he was playing and saying, you know what? I want you, every single time you get a basket, I want you to acknowledge the guy that passed it to you. I want you to point to him. I want you to smile at you. I want to look at him. And he always said to the player, and one player said, well, coach, what if he's not looking? He said, don't worry. If he's not looking, I will be.
I love that. You know, the moment where I knew I wanted to become a sports psychologist, because the original plan was I thought I was going to be a professional coach and kind of work my way up through the ranks that way. In the gold medal game of U16 AAA, I was coaching a CAC team. And we were at the gold medal game, and there was a player on my team who, year after year after year, he's always the last guy picked. He's always playing at the highest level, but always the last guy, right? That 13th board kind of guy. And for some reason during provincials, he just found this whole other level. He was playing out of his mind. And so I was double shifting him like all of the time. And in the gold medal game, when we were up 3-0, maybe there was like 5 or 6 minutes left in the game, he's exhausted. I have been putting him on any time I could get him on the ice. And he turns around and he looks at me and he's like, coach, like, why are you playing me so much? It's because you're worthy. It's because you're good enough. You've earned it. And like his whole team like hugged him on the bench during the provincial game. And why that stands out to me is that when I turned to the right, I looked at the other bench, and the coach on the other team had been yelling and screaming and swearing and just drilling into his team. And it was like my team in front of me hugging each other, crying on the bench with 5 minutes to go in the gold medal game, and the whole other team looking at what was happening on my bench. And I could just feel the paradox between how different those two experiences were. And I was like, this has got to change.
And, it's a fascinating thing because I look at minor sports and hockey parents are crazy. No, I can go hockey. So I can go, you can find any sport where you have some people get too emotionally wrapped up in their son or daughter's sporting activities. And you have some parents or some board members on the association that are the same way. And winning becomes the focus point over everything else. And hey, winning's fun. Don't get me wrong. People love to win. So talking about it from an amateur sports level where it's not their job, right? Now you don't get as much time with them either. But if you looked at amateur coaches and minor, and I don't care if you're AA or if you're tier 6, how can you start and what would be some paths or directions that coaches should take to start to implement to this that would likely allow to more success outside of the X and O's? And of course you want to help them learn how to skate or stop or start. I get all that, right? But where does that part come in, Matt? And how can amateur coaches help it, at the young ages, whether it's 9, 10, 11, all the way up to U18?
No, that's the right question. We talk about it all the time here, at Mind Buffs, that it's actually the change we're looking for is going to happen if coaches make the change. We can only impact the team culture so much, but the coach has to be the one that drives that. And so when we work with coaches, whether it's in our group like workshops or like one-on-one, the first thing we have to discover is like, what is the personal barrier that coach has to being more vulnerable with their players? Is it because of their definition of masculine, their definition of success? Is it because, emotions were a negative experience growing up because they only ever saw the dark side of it rather than like the loving side of it that you were talking about, Ritch? We need to figure out like, what is our personal barrier to building connections with our players? Because once a player has bought into like being a part of a team and playing for a coach, they will literally do anything for you. So the success you're looking for, the wins that you want as a coach, the most advantageous thing is to discover like, what is the part of me that might be getting in the way of me building stronger relationships with my players? And then from there, you can kind of build that value system and your coaching philosophy. But we're all going to have baggage from childhood. We're all going to have baggage from our own coaches from when we played hockey. So you need to figure out like, what is that one thing getting in the way of me communicating more openly with my players?
I think, Matt, one of the things, I don't know if you'd agree, is just not having the tools. They don't know what to do, so they're stuck and they don't know where to go, because it's tough being a coach because you're supposed to know what you're doing. You're supposed to know about leadership. So to admit that I'm kind of struggling here to the GM or to the owner or even to some of your better players in the leadership group, that's tough. It's pride comes into the way, and then they just don't get the help. And that's
not the coach's fault. Like that's the culture of, at least I'll just speak to hockey. That's the culture of hockey, that for some reason, like hockey and organizations and parents expect coaches to know everything and to be able to do everything. And that's an impossible position to be at. It demands that a coach is striving for perfection to feel like they're doing a good job. And, to be bold, to actually say, I'm not sure how to do this. I don't know if we have a culture where a coach would be allowed to say that without all of a sudden everyone doubting their abilities as a coach.
And then
So
one
that
of the
is
things
the
I
place that
would
I am
suggest,
most interested in impacting, is like educating coaches.
I would say, Matt, like one of the things I think in many of these coaches, the great coaches never talk about winning. Winning's a result. And I think if you change the focus, I want you to be the best of which you're capable. That's what we can do together. And it changes the focus from the individual very quickly. I loved one of Wooden's comments he used to make to coaches. He would go watch coaches have practice, give them advice, and they'd say, I thought you played the 3-5-9-2 offense. And he said, well, yeah, we do. And I've taught that to the guys. We've been working on it all year. And coach would always respond to that by saying, they're not doing it, but more importantly, coach, you need to understand, you have not taught until they've learned.
Yeah.
And that really flips it over, because you hear all these coaches, I don't know what's wrong with these kids.
Yes.
Like, geez, I've been hammering this all year. Well, that's not their responsibility. And once that responsibility shifts, Matt, then I
Yes.
think the players immediately start to feel the love. They feel the coach is responsible. Like what Coach Wooden never talked about. He was never a coach in his mind. He was a teacher who had stewardship over some young men. It's a totally different perspective.
Like one thing I just want to say on that, this is one of my favorite parenting metaphors that I actually do like to bring into like leadership and coaching. Like as a parent, you're disillusioned if you think that you're an engineer of your child, that you can genetically, behaviorally engineer your child to be exactly who you want them to be. That's
Right.
not going to happen. And if that's your goal, you're going to have a tough time. Your job as a parent, your job as a coach is to be a shepherd. What field what field do my athletes need for them to be able to be at their best? So we need to set agendas aside as leaders. We bring our philosophy, we bring our vision and our values, but every year the players are different. I might have to change the way I approach things. I might have to change my systems. What I'm in control of is bringing the best out of my players. So we are shepherds, not engineers.
Well, Matt, I always use the example of, the hardest real love is when the kids are hard to love, right? I mean, we all experience that as parents.
God. Any coach
so
will
good.
tell you, like, you got a few kids, anybody listening who's ever coached, or teachers or parents, you got a few kids who you can tell them the drill 5 times, right? And their heads in the clouds and they don't pay attention. You're just like, oh my God. Like it can be frustrating.
Well, I mean, I always use the example of Dennis Rodman, right? Dennis Rodman went and won, I think, 2 or 3 championships in Chicago. I can't remember if it was 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And Coach Jackson just accepted Dennis as Dennis, so we had to give him a leeway. We had to integrate him into the group. We had to spend time with him and let him know we cared about him, no matter what erratic kind of behavior he emitted, because he's a heck of a member of the team and he did work hard with his teammates. Yeah. And that work ethic inspired the rest of his teammates. I can only imagine, Matt, if a young Dennis Rodman had taken up hockey and walked into a Western Hockey League training camp, what would have happened? It wouldn't have mattered how good he was.
No,
he would have been out of there by noon. And that's
100% agree.
And that's a great metaphor, because ultimately those players, and we see it in New England, we see it in great cultures. They used to bring in players that had challenges because their culture was so strong that, and Satya Nadella, like when he took over Microsoft, he listed 3 things as critical to turning Microsoft around. One was a vision, which he had, pulling the team together that he needed, and he bought 85 companies, and having the culture to support it. They'd lost their way at Microsoft. So he brought Mike in after his experiences in sport to recreate the culture at Microsoft. Culture is important in your home. Culture is important at work. And culture is critically important to success in professional or amateur sports. People just don't understand that, because it's sort of like, it's just that last bit of progression that we need to make as sportsmen, right?
I completely agree. Yeah, no, there already is a model that exists. Like when we look at like Premier League soccer, most of those clubs hire a team of sport and performance psychologists, so that there is support at the ownership level, support at the management level, and multiple different supports at both like the training staff and the player level. And so you
Right.
have like these layers built in so that you have people who understand the brain more than anyone else to help them guide an incredibly difficult, powerful, well-known ship towards like what the goal is, to what their values are. And so we know that hockey's a little bit behind when it comes to incorporating those kinds of things.
Matt, we had Slater Kuko on a while back, Jason, and he talked about, because it's important that it's not just the coach. You create a culture of love, respect, and compassion. They take care of each other. Remember,
Right.
Slater's comments was he loved Jonathan Toews because he included everybody in everything. Slater was just a piece, didn't play for, he was in the press box early on there for 10 or 12 games, still included in everything, made him feel part of it. So what teams need to do, Matt, is organization needs to hydrate the coaching staff and the
Yes.
leadership group with the skills they need. Because now you're not just relying on a coach. You're relying on a coach, an assistant coach, a goalie coach, a couple of trainers, 4 or 5 in your leadership group. And then a
Exactly.
kid that's on the fourth line who has very little skill, but has a high level of emotional intelligence and drives a lot of what they do well. And that's when this is why they define love, respect, and compassion is so important, because when it's completely imbued throughout the whole culture of the team, it will drive them, like Phil Jackson says, to places they could never get on their own.
Rich, you just said something to me. It's fascinating, Matt. So in minor sports, specifically in hockey, the captain is usually, quote, the best player at 10 or 11, 12 years of age, right? Rich just said something that's fascinating to me. Emotionally mature. And a lot of the best players, they're the best player. They don't say much. I can kind of laugh about why we have a captain at the end of the day. They don't talk to the officials. What the hell is the point? But anyway, I look at it and say, they might be the best player, but they have no idea how to communicate to their teammates. Like, they can show you a really good work ethic, which is super important, but they might not have anything else. And so maybe in a lot of times the captain, like when the Edmonton Oilers rave about Lee Fogland, they never raved about his ability as a player.
Exactly.
It was Lee Fogland. They talked about how he's a father figure. He wasn't that much older than them, but he was like a father figure. And it seemed like he would have hard conversations and real conversations with them to understand, like, you have to be mature and you can't go party 24/7. But at the same time, you can still party a little bit because you're 20 and 21 and you're living the time of your life. And so I wonder sometimes, how can a coach, like, what are signs that you have some kids on your team that maybe are a little bit more, could be those emotional leaders for your group and can help, bring the culture that you want in your team, a loving culture? How do you find that out in young players?
The team already knows. You only have to be with the boys for a month before like, who's the guy on the team that's the glue guy. Who's the one who like cares about everyone, that can hang out with anyone in the locker room, outside the locker room. The players already know that. So the players just need to talk, or the coaches just need to talk to the players and ask them, like, who's the emotional captain of this ship?
Right.
Because it's also unfair to put that incredibly highly skilled player who might be the biggest introvert on the team.
Right.
It's unfair to put a C on that guy. He doesn't want, like, he might like the recognition of it, but he doesn't have the same extroverted, emotionally intelligent skills as like someone with a different personality. Put an A on him 100%, like recognize like his talent and the value that he brings. But that captain should be someone who cares for the emotional culture of the team. That's an important skill. We know emotional intelligence, even in the workforce, is, according to Forbes magazine, the most valued skill to bring into the workforce going forward. So, but the players will tell the coaches, they know who that person is.
And just so listeners know, emotional intelligence is the ability to understand your own emotions and identify them in others so you can react to them. And I think the best indicator of who the captain should have been, and we all know this guy, he's 36, he's 37, he's 38, and they signed him for another year because he's good in the room, right? Because he understands and support players. That guy probably should have been the captain 10 years ago, but he was a fourth liner, so it didn't fit the mold. Everyone wants, like you say, the skilled guy to be the captain, but it's just, again, it comes back to teaching the coaches the skills they need to identify those types of people.
Like, I look at a young Connor McDavid at 19 years of age, and I was like, why are they giving him the captaincy? He's the best player, but he doesn't need the C to motivate him to work harder, right? He could have been the Oilers finally gave it to Gretzky when Lee Fogland's like, I think now he's ready.
Yeah, right? I think we've seen Connor grow into a really good captain.
Yes, but he didn't need to be at 19, right? There was no
Didn't.
reason. You can't rush emotional intelligence. And Connor, if anybody who knows him, Connor's naturally more of an introvert than he is an extrovert, right?
Mhm.
Now, he cares about his teammates, he's
Yep.
super loyal to his teammates, all those sorts of things. But you're coming in, you got all this pressure. Now it's like, let's put the C on him. And I think organizations are like, well, let's put all the responsibility on him now, because if it doesn't work, well, he's the captain. I don't even know if they're consciously thinking that. Like, there was talk about Bedard being the captain, and I was like, what? That is the most idiotic thing I can think of, right? Like, because they're not even close. At least the Oilers had some decent players around and whatever, but that's just an example. And so I love, Matt, when you talk about it's unfair at a young level. You might have the best player. Now, if you want to acknowledge him, you can give him an associate captain, right, at 11 or 12. But the thing is, most kids always know, whether you're U10, U15, in the NHL, they know who the best players are. Right, you don't need to ask them. Like, you ask them to rank it, they would rank it right away. So, it got me thinking about, the pressure of the captaincy and how you might be better off at a young age, A, maybe not to even have it, or B, find the emotional one and rotate it and get everybody an opportunity in the first month until the kids get to know each other.
It's funny because I have I only hang stuff up in my office from Hall of Famers, so players don't ask. When they ask why they're not on the wall, it's pretty easy to address it, but I have
so
a jersey.
Basically, you show them who your favorites are.
No, but
that's what I heard too.
You guys, you make the Hall of Fame, and your jersey goes right up beside Host's. But I have Host's jersey with an A on it. Right. He wore an A for a few weeks in Chicago when Duncan Keith was hurt. And Marion never wanted an A, and everybody on that team, everybody knows they hadn't won a cup for 60 years before he arrived, and they haven't won a cup, or they haven't won a playoff round since he left. He was the glue that sat with Patrick, sat with Jonathan, sat with those young kids. But it was fun. I always remember the reason I put this particular jersey up in my office is because he went and he struggled a bit when they put the A on him. He went back to Quenneville and said, "Joel, can we get this thing off me, man? It's so heavy." But it's an interesting metaphor, because what Matt has said, now we know that the A itself isn't that heavy, but it is very heavy for the kid that's not ready, or in Marion's case, very mature guy, just a young man who doesn't want it. Yeah. He just is comfortable leading with example. I think you're better, Matt, to go off to say to your young superstar, look, we're relying on you for a lot of things. You just lead by example, and let Lee Fogelin handle the captaincy, because he's got a lot of time on his hands. He doesn't have interviews to do, and he's really attuned to the guys. He's been here longer. Give them the freedom to just be as good as they can 100%. Be. Sometimes giving them the captaincy is going to prevent them from being as good as they can be. You as a coach need to learn the skills to help identify that.
There are other ways to honor and acknowledge the contribution of a highly skilled player other than just putting a letter on their jersey.
Yeah. Well, Matt Moissac joins us. He, of course, is a registered psychologist. We're talking. We started the whole conversation. I want to get back to that before we wrap up. We were talking about, a key ingredient, and Ritch talked about just love at the pro level, but even at the minor hockey level, and how you have to integrate that into your team, and I love, Matt, what you said earlier about, it starts with the coach, and the one thing the coach has to look at is, what is the part of me that's getting in the way of being more connected with my players? How, or maybe it's not allowing me to communicate as well as I would like. And I think that's the hard, because most coaches, hey, I coach, I've never even thought of that question, to be honest, till you mentioned it. I was like, God, I got to think about that, because we all have biases. Yeah. Everybody has a bias. There's certain kids that you coach that you love for. I don't always love the best players per se, but you love the ones who try really hard, or maybe the ones who's always friendly or funny. And then there's the other kids on the other side that sometimes just like, oh, this kid frustrates the what out of me. And so I want to, do you have advice for coaches? Because I think any coach out there, any parent, any teacher, at certain times your kids frustrate the hell out of you too. But how can you get past that frustration and turn that, whatever that personality trait is of a player, into something that you as a coach can look past and kind of get?
Great question. Two things come to my mind. Like, one, it's one of the very first things that we educate coaches in is, like, have you laid clear ground rules that the players have all bought in to, and are they aware of, like, what the accountability is going to look like if they, like, break that team rule? And honestly, that should be done at an organization level, so that it's just, like, consistent throughout. That way, like, coaches don't feel like, especially ones who really care, they don't feel like they're being the bad guy for having to, like, discipline or consequence a player for not, like, following what the team rules are. So when you have that system built in, your players look to you as a coach to hold players accountable for not, following what those rules are. And you lose respect if you don't hold that line. So I would say, as a preventative measure, am I creating a system and values and rules that the team is all buying into, that we all know what the accountability system looks like? And secondly, the very first session that we do with players and coaches is we have the whole team, players, coaches, training staff, do a personality test. That way the coaches know who they're working with.
Right.
There are 4 different types of people when it comes to motivation, for example. There are people who are intrinsically motivated. They only care about their own values and their own expectations. We call them questioners. There's what makes up like half of the human race. We call them obligers. That's why we love them on team sports, because they're always going to do what other people want. Their motivation comes from making the teammates proud, from proving to the coach and their parents that they're good enough. Then there's these upholders who are very good at managing both the external and like internal expectations. And then there's me. I'm a rebel. There's not many of us. We're like 10%. We hate all expectations. We need to have this feeling of like freedom and autonomy to kind of find our own way, as long as we're following the rules. But as soon as there's this pressure of like expectation, like Dennis Rodman 1000% was a rebel. You needed to give him the space for him to be himself. And even that small amount of information for coaching staff will immediately change the kind of language they use to inspire and motivate the players to buy into the system. So personality, you got to know your players.
And a lot of Dennis Rodman, if you read up on it, he got kicked out of his own house, right?
Yeah.
He never really had love. Like he acted out a little bit, because if you look at him when he was a member of the Pistons, he didn't have the flamboyant hair or anything. It's as he got a little bit more confident, more of his personality had always repressed started to come out a little bit more. But a lot of it, he was a very insecure young man for the longest part of his life. And, he's talked about it in his book and other places. And so that's a hard thing, I would think, for minor coaches to, that's pretty deep to get into. And so,
I just want to follow up on what Matt said about accountability, because we see it all the time, coaches keeping, the fourth line accountable, nobody else. And it's just, it's really incongruent with any sensible form of values. But Barry Trotz told me once that he was convinced, I don't know what game it was, that they won the Stanley Cup at let's say it was game 47.
Right.
Because what happened at game 47, probably wrong on the date. What happened was Alex Ovechkin missed a team meeting and half a practice. So Barry went to Alex and said, you know the rule.
Yeah.
You're sitting tonight. And he said something to the effect, you have 2 choices. You can call Ted, the owner, you can make some fuss. Maybe he'll leverage me a little bit and get me to put you back in the lineup, or you can take it like a man. Sit upstairs, accept your punishment, and show this team that the rules apply to everybody. And Ovi, to his credit, went and sat in the press box for a game. And that's when, in Barry Trotz's mind, the Washington Capitals shifted
100%.
Point that led them to winning the Stanley Cup.
That moment is critical, because the whole team now knows that they have a leader and a coach that they can fully trust and whose words are truth.
And a leader who takes responsibility, which leads them, Matt, to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it is. There are certain moments like that. Matt, one last one for you, because we always try to tie this into, we always talk a lot of pro sports, but I think, the minor sports level really matters. You work with coaches. Do you have any advice, for a coach who's looking to find, what are their limitations first? How do you go about finding out your limitations first as a coach that's going to help you become a better coach?
I would say, who knows you the best? And then ask them that question. What do you feel like are my limitations for me being a better communicator, more vulnerable, more open? There's definitely someone in your life that knows the answer to that question if you don't.
Ooh.
And there might be more than you think
Mm-hmm.
that know that. Yeah, and the only one that doesn't know it is most often you.
Oh, yeah. And then the other thing is knowing it, but then changing it.
Yeah.
Right. Like that, to me, that's the hardest part. Like I know with
It
my
is.
limits, I can get frustrated really quickly. And, and then sometimes I won't say anything, and then it just builds up, and then a Mount Vesuvius later. Right. I know that, but I don't know how to change it. Right. Like I think, I'll just be calmer. Well, that really hasn't worked.
Right. So like this, I won't go like too much into it, but this is where I would get all like technical in my industry is like we would need to kind of find like what is the limiting belief? What's the negative core belief? Is it I'm
Okay.
not good enough, I have to be perfect, I'm a failure? Change can only happen when we're making that change at that subconscious level. So you might understand like the behavior that you want to change and that's like negatively impacting people around you. You can try to change the behavior at the surface level as much as you want, but if you're not addressing the root of where that's coming from, that core belief, then change isn't going to happen. And for those of you that aren't quite sure what I'm talking about, go watch Inside Out 1 and Inside Out 2. It's exactly what I'm talking about.
Matt, thanks so much for this. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, guys. A lot of
Hey,
fun.
Matt, thanks a lot.
That's Matt Moissac from Mind Buffs, and that was a real quick hour. We actually even blew through a break just because it was such a riveting conversation. And Ritch, I love you bringing up this topic, and it's something that we're going to readdress, I think, in the future because I don't think one show was enough to focus on. And I know we have some stories about Lou Lamoriello that I think when I come back from holidays we can touch on again, and Pete Carroll leading up to the Super Bowl and everything. But I think it's a really good starting point. We've got a lot of texts from people. Just having the conversation here is just a way to start it. To just think about the importance of love in an organization, obviously for your favorite pro franchise, and some of them have it. But even if you volunteer and you're a coach at the whatever, you're coaching ringette, you're coaching soccer, you're coaching volleyball, what have you, and that importance to get a trust factor and love. And I think from a coaching perspective first, I love how Matt brought up the fact that you have to look within first and find out what your limitations are.
Yeah.
You get those, then you probably have a better chance to
I would
improve
think if
the limitations of your
if
players.
everybody listening to this program took Coach Wooden's advice over the next course of the next couple of 3 weeks, this would change their life. Do one thing every day, guys, that for someone else who can never repay you. Look for that opportunity every day, and you'll get a sense of why Coach Wooden was voted the coach of the century by both ESPN and Sports Illustrated.
Ritch, great stuff, my man. We will talk to you again on the Business of Sport. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks for having me. Good day.